Hi, everybody. This is Silvio Canto in Dallas, Texas on Friday, May the 17th. And today it's a great honor to bring back our friend Mailyn Salabarria, who is a fellow Cuban. And we have a lot to talk about. You know, every time I have the opportunity to meet another Cuban, I enjoy it a great deal because we Cubans, it seems like we all have a different story. And it's to some extent the consequence of our experiences. As everybody knows, I left Cuba when I was 12 with my parents, and I did not live the same experience that our guest is going to tell us about. But I remember Comité de Defensa. I remember
Oh
that
yeah.
because they had just started. They had just started, and I remember Las Colas. Who can forget that? So I remember all of that, but obviously most of my upbringing was here in the United States. So I didn't go through, everything that our guest is going to go through. So let me welcome our dear friend Mailyn Salabarria. I love that last name with the two R's. I love that Salabarria. So
Thank
is
you,
there
Sylvia.
did I put the accent in the right place?
Yeah, you
Salabarria?
got it right. Thank you so much for the invitation.
My pleasure.
As usual, it's an honor to be here and be able to talk to you and to
Well,
your
it is
audience.
so cool for me to talk to fellow Cubans, um, especially of different generations. We all came here looking for the same thing, but we just came here at different times. So tell me a little bit about your Cuban story. I mean, what part of Cuba are you from? And where did you grow up in the island? I was born in Sabana Grande and lived as a little boy. And just to give you a little story,
Mhm.
as a little boy, I lived in Sabana Grande, in Ciego de Avila, Jatibonico, and Havana. And the
Mhm.
reason that I lived in four little places like that in a short time is because my father was a banker with Banco Continental Cubano, which is a bank. It was a Cuban bank that existed at the time. And he kept getting promoted, to a bigger branch, if you will. So he started in Sabana Grande, his hometown. Then we went to Ciego de Avila, my mother's hometown. And then we went to Jatibonico, which was not a very big town, but that's
Mhm.
where we were. It seemed like Jatibonico was surrounded by a lot of farmers. And most of my father's customers were farmers. I
Mhm.
remember going with my father one day to see some of the farmers that he worked with. So it was just a cool experience. And then eventually he was promoted to La Habana, where the bigger branch,
Mhm.
and that's where we were. So I've had the opportunity to live in these four places, and I remember La Carretera Central. I
Mhm.
remember uh, I don't know, just so many things about Cuba. Santa Maria del Mar, the beach in La
Mhm.
Habana, El Túnel de La Habana. I remember that. I remember going to a park one day and seeing Los Reyes Magos and Los Camellos. I remember that. So,
Oh,
that was,
quite different experience from
well,
mine.
that's it.
Sure.
And that's, I bring that up. I bring that up because you probably didn't see Reyes Magos. But,
Uh,
but anyway, so that's my story in a short, very short, quick
mhm.
story. And then I come to the United States and I grow up here. And then all of a sudden, 50, 60 years goes by and you keep saying, my goodness, Cuba hasn't changed.
It's
So,
still the same. Yep.
yeah. Well, tell
So
me your story. Where were you
it's
born?
quite a
And
different story, Silvio. It's like,
please.
we always joke and say that, any Cuban that at any point is able to make it out of the island has enough stories to write an entire book. So we got to be mindful of time and try to condense it all in the little time that we have for the show. I would say that the biggest first contrast is that it's like the generational difference. Like you were explaining, like you were a child and then you lived with your parents. In my case, I grew up was, I was born and raised in Cuba. I left first without having any family in the United States.
Mhm.
And then I was the one who got my parents out when I became an American citizen. So right there, you have like the stark difference of the generation dynamics in 50 years. However, the root cause of the problem remains the same. I was born in Havana. My dad used to work in several construction companies, live a little bit of time in the Isla de Pinos, in the island on the other side, a little bit in Camagüey, and then I would say most of my life was in Havana on the eastern side of the tunnel that you were mentioning, Alamar next to Kohima, which is like this, gray, ugly, Soviet style looking neighborhood for the working class with, ugly, crumbling down buildings and whatnot. So that was the place where I spent most of my life in Cuba. My mom's side of the family is from Guane in Pinal del Rio. They were in a very small town. My grandparents on that side of the family, they used to have a small bodega and a small fonda, which would be the equivalent of what we have here in the United States as a very small business or a small family restaurant. That was obviously expropriated by the Cuban government, because you know that they started first with the evil American companies, then with the evil Cuban capitalists, and at some point they removed the right to private property and a small business from everybody, pretty much every single person.
And I think, forgive me for
in
interrupting
the
you,
island.
but let me just make a quick point so that for some of the listeners who may not know the story, they pretty much destroyed capitalism by the end of the 60s, right?
Mhm.
In other words, I think there were some private companies during the 60s, but by the end of the 60s, they had pretty much done away with
But yeah, by the
capitalism.
time that I was born, the Constitution of 1940 in Cuba, which, by the way, by whoever, if someone doesn't know about it, the Cuban Constitution before Castro took over was modeled after the United States Constitution, based on the same foundational principles. By the time that I was born, Fidel Castro and the Communist Party has already abolished that constitution, had enacted the socialist new one that basically outlawed private property. Everything was collective property under the control of the government. And by then was when that last wave of expropriating and eliminating all kind of businesses, small ones and any size, kind of like hit that part of my family. On my dad's side of the family,
So let me ask you a very quick question about
Mhm.
your family's la fonda. I had not heard that word, by the way, in a long time. Fonda. I had not heard that word in a long time. Thank you for bringing that one back. But that was expropriated, what, in the 60s or 70s
I
or?
cannot remember the exact year, but it was before I was born. So I would say it was roughly between 1966 and
Right.
1971. And again,
Okay.
we
And
need, like in American terms, we need to think about it like a micro business. If the fonda is
right,
like a
right,
small
right.
family little restaurant, it had only like 3 or 4 tables with 4 chairs each. They would open reduced hours with the lunch menu and the dinner menu. So we have to think about it in 2024 terms. It would be literally a micro
Right.
business, a micro enterprise. So that was kind of like the part on the side of the family that, again, it was from this small town in Guane, Pinar del Rio, which is like the westernmost
Right.
part
Right.
of the island. And then on my dad's side of the family, they are from Ciudad de Avila, Camagüey, Faya. I still have second, third cousins that live in there. They were like a mostly a larger family that work, in the fields in a very agricultural area, cattle raising type of
Mhm.
provinces in Cuba. So
Right.
that's kind of like the two combinations of the family. My dad's side of the family originally starting, I think it was with my great grandfather. They are originally from the Basque Country in Spain. That's where the weird Salabarria comes from, because it's typical in the language that is spoken in that province of Spain that is on the north side, closer up to France. But like I said, I was born and raised mostly in Havana. I went through, the K-12 government controlled indoctrination schools, including being in middle and high school in what they call becas, which is like a boarding school that the socialist government in Cuba heavily influenced and counseled by the Soviet Union. Back then, you also have to remember the Cuba that I was born and I grew up with. The best way that I have to describe it, Silvio, is it was like a satellite colony of the Soviet Union. That was my teenage years, high school years. Even when I finished the university in Cuba, it was still the same.
Now,
so
let
I
me
was
ask
in
you.
that system of those schools that I was literally a ward of the government
Right.
for 11 days, consecutive 11 days, and I would spend only 2 weekends a month in my house with my parents and my family.
Interesting. Now, I just have again. You reminded me of something. Were you part of Los Pioneros?
I had to. It was
Right.
mandatory. There was no
Right.
opt-out forms to do any of that.
Right. So Los Pioneros was mandatory. See, I
It
missed
was
that.
mandatory, yeah. And then you
Yeah.
have to swear alliance to the murdering psychopath of Ernesto Che Guevara, whether you like it or not. And then it was that generation mindset where, in order to survive, the coping mechanism is that in a school, in public, in the place where you work, you wear one persona, and then at home with your family, with your
Right.
trusted circle of people, then you wear another one. So it was basically a survival skill that since you were a
Right.
child, parents would teach you, like, oh yeah, you have to say pioneros por comunismo, seremos
Right.
como Che, otherwise you're going to get in trouble.
Right. And
It
that's
doesn't
what
matter
I.
what you think at home.
Right. And that's what I heard over and over and over again. Talking to, let's say, Cubans of my generation who left in the 70s or 80s and came here, and they would always say que los cubanos tienen dos caras.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, that Cubans
Yeah.
had two faces. One, the public face, which they had to do out of, I guess, convenience or survival, and then you had the private face, which is when you actually told people what you really felt, and that is so difficult, Mailyn. That is so difficult to explain to people. I've had so many American friends who don't know how you can live in a society where you actually have two faces, as they say, where you are a public person who has to support
Mm-hmm.
the repressive government, and then in private you kind of get away and you can tell your wife or your sister or your brother how you really
But
feel.
is it really that hard in 2024 United States today, Silvio? Think about cancel culture and what is happening
Yes, that's
with
right.
the advent of social media in the United States today. This is something that I bring up in my presentations when I talk to high school students very often, when we talk about the importance of free speech and how the core of the First Amendment right is not to protect what we agree with, but
Right.
it's respecting the space for people that we don't agree with to say what they have to say, because cancel culture is literally the gateway drug for tyranny. It's
That's
just
right.
that what took 50 years in Cuba, 20 years in Venezuela, nowadays in the United States and other Western societies, is happening faster because of the advent of technology and the
Right.
internet and social media. But when you think about it, the core root of suppressing or chilling the speech of somebody else, the technique and the foundation that is based on the government control over people's free speech is pretty much the same. What
Right.
changes, is the instrument and the speed where you see the deliverable of those results.
No, you're right. You're exactly right about that. And that's what has always scared me the most about this cancel culture.
Mhm.
How similar, that was to, for example, the way Castro rewrote history. I mean, I can remember photographs where people would disappear, historical
Mhm.
photographs where people would disappear. My father I would show my father a picture, and my father would say, "Wait a minute, there used to be Camilo Cienfuegos used to be in that picture,
And
or
it's not
somebody else,
anymore.
and
Yeah.
not anymore." So that is a technique that sadly we're seeing that here. Now, I am fascinated with the next topic. Now you're a young woman, you're growing up in Cuba, and let's say, at what point in this development, in your development as pionera or whatever you were, when do you just wake up one day, or maybe not one day, but when do you say, this is not good? This is
Mhm.
not what I want. This is not what they're telling me. So when did you, in a sense, find out that communism was a great lie? When
Well,
did that come to you?
in my case, Silvio, it was not like one single event.
Hmm.
I would say that it was like a gradual process of eye opening, of awakening experiences that I was able to witness. And it took a little bit. I would say it started happening after I left this boarding school in high school, because remember, when you are completely removed from your family, you're not seeing your average Cuban on the day-to-day struggle of their life or anything like that. You are literally in a bubble where the government puts you in, and it's a little bit harder to see that. I would say that the first red flag started when I was in the last year of high school. It was around the time that the Soviet Union started crumbling down. So all the usual mind control, political brainwashing, and all that, it became harder. It became like it literally went on steroids, especially for the younger generations. So I started seeing things in the school that didn't make any sense. Things like, for example, that they started asking us to report if we hear somebody would go to church or would read the Bible and things like that. And you got to remember, I am the generation that grew up seeing my maternal grandmother hiding her Bible and all her religious images inside the closet, because if someone from the neighborhood would come in, I would see it, in the living room or something like that. They would report her to the committees for the defense of the revolution. I mean, I wasn't baptized in Cuba because my parents knew that they would run the risk to be fired from their jobs. I was actually baptized here, as an interesting story, at age 33 in a joint ceremony with my son, born in the United States as an adult. So it was that period of time. And then once that I started to go to the university, which was also another eye-opening experience, because, in places like Cuba, you don't get to decide where you go to college or which major do you want to pursue or anything like that. I graduated in one of the top of my class. I wanted to be a journalist. I wanted to be a lawyer, or I wanted to study international relationships, to be, like a diplomat. Neither of those happened to me because I am just the daughter of my mom and my dad. I wasn't connected with nobody in the higher elites of the party, in the government, in any ministry or anything like that. Long story short, I was assigned to study agricultural engineering. Nothing wrong with studying that if that is your calling, if that is what you like. But it wasn't mine. So I found an alternative way to go to law school. Remember, this is the Cuba without computers, without internet or anything like that. So in those years, it was 1992 when I graduated from high school, the equivalent of online distance education was a distance program that they have for 2 or 3 very limited careers in the Havana University, and one of them was law school. So you basically needed to buy the books. They will give you the curriculum guides. It was like an auto self-taught program, and then you will have to go and do the exams and the testing for each course. And I did that for 5 years while I was working full-time in tourism, by the way, because it was the only way to make dollars in the tips and be able to survive on a daily basis. So in all those years that I was doing that, I mean, it was a crash course on real life as a young adult. A series of things started to happen. First of all, in the second, third year of law school, I started to see the contradictions into what we were being taught in lectures about property rights, personal rights, and all that, and what was happening in real life. And at some point, I reached a moment where I say, hold on a second, like, I know I'm writing this in this test because I need the grade, because I need to pass this course to graduate. But this is a lie. This is not what is happening around me in real life. I was in Havana when the tugboat 13 de Marzo was sunk. So I saw that from the other side of the Malecón. I saw all the manipulation of the media, of the Communist Party pressuring the witnesses to say one thing on the Cuban TV that it was completely different from what happened. I actually used to work in a restaurant that is in La Cabaña, and we had a meeting. The state security came. All that happened right in front of us, at the entrance of the Havana Harbor. And we had a state security and the police come and have an all-staff meeting with us. And they told us that what we saw was not what really happened. That what really happened is what they told us in that meeting that happened. So imagine the red flags, going.
Right.
I was in Cuba when the Maleconazo happened. too in
Right.
1994, which prompted, the rafter crisis during the Clinton administration, when Fidel Castro took the tanks out of in Malecon to repress the people that were protesting and all that. I live in Alamar, half a block from the ocean. I saw longtime neighbors, classmates from elementary school jumping in rafts, praying and hoping that they were going to be spotted by Brother to the Rescues, picked up by the U.S. Coast Guard, and taken to the refugee camp in Guantanamo Bay as a hope to get into that refugee process to come to the United States. I was in Cuba when the whole crisis with Elian Gonzalez happens. All that happened. So I got
Oh,
like the
wow.
other side of that process in there. I had a cousin, like a second, third cousin, that was a painter in Cuba, and he found a way to sell his art. Back then, the possession of American dollars was illegal in Cuba. It was considered illegal possession of foreign currency, and you could go to jail up to 5 years for that. So I saw him being prosecuted for that, like his artistic freedom of speech, you name it, completely removed. I saw the entire circus of the trial and all that. So it was, I would say, it was like
Yeah.
like a little buildup of all those things happen. I have a brother, half brother and half sister, that were in Germany, in what used to be communist Germany. Obviously, when the Berlin Wall fell, they were the ones that were first able to come and meet us in Cuba, and then they start telling us the stories of what happened in Germany and Berlin when the Berlin Wall fell. So
Right.
it fell, and so it was all that combinations of things. And then at the end, I think it was the last year when I was in law school, because I was pretty close to graduate. I remember having this conversation with my mom one day, and my mom was like the number one that was never on board with the Cuban government. She was a teenager
Hmm.
when Castro took over. And I remember talking to her. I was literally just like venting out with her about the contradictions, the things that I was seeing, blah, blah, blah. And my mom told me, you know what, you need to, hang in there, finish the courses that you have to finish. You have to graduate, because you never know anything that you learn, any diploma that you get, it's a knowledge that you have. No government can take that away from you, regardless of where you live. But you know what she told me? She told me, you need to graduate and you need to get out of here.
Right.
Because
Right.
if you go and you practice law in this country, you're going to end up in jail with whoever is the person that
Right.
you're trying to represent.
That's
And I
right.
would say that was like the whole, process of that awakening, eye-opening experience for me.
Yes. No, it's fascinating because I've heard similar stories from others. For example, I have a friend here in the Dallas area who left with Mariel. That was a little bit before your experience,
Mhm.
but he became disillusioned in the 70s when he began to see similar contradictions, just like
Mhm.
you're seeing. You know, for example, I had one time an experience. I was talking to a Mexican, and there were two Mexicans, and I was talking to both of them. And one said to the other, the system, the healthcare system in Cuba is really good. And the other Mexican said, wait a minute. So why do they keep asking for medicine from their friends
Mhm.
or their family in Miami? I mean, how can it be that good if they're always asking for medicine? And I remember in 1989 that my aunt came to the United States. My mother's only sister came to the United States. How she got permission, I don't know, but I think it may have had something to do with the fact that my grandfather was Spanish. I think maybe she was able to exploit that somehow to get out of Cuba for a week or two. And she visited with us, and all she was saying during all that time was, "Yo necesito comprar espejuelos," because I said, "Well, wait." I said, "We used to call her Mamama. That was the nickname for her." And I said to her in Spanish, "Mamama, ¿cómo que tú necesitas comprar espejuelos? What do you mean you have to buy glasses? Don't they have glasses
Mhm.
in Cuba?" And she said, "No, mijo, esa es la mentira. That's the
Mhm.
lie. The only glass." And so she explained a lot of things to me. Not that they were new to me, but they simply confirmed, what I had heard over time. And so it is fascinating to me to hear the stories, because all the stories confirm the same thing,
Mhm.
that communism is a lie, that the whole thing is just a super, super lie. And the only way they can stay in power is basically through repression.
Mhm.
That's the only way they can stay in power. Well,
Pressure,
let
censorship, and manipulation.
manipulation,
Propaganda,
and
basically,
like you
that's
were
what.
saying, with the schools where they brainwash
Mhm.
the people. Well, take us now to the present a little bit, because we have the clock to worry about.
Yeah.
So we can do this some other time, but let's focus now on what you're doing now, because I love what you're doing now. You're talking to students, and
Yes,
you're
I am. So
please
I
tell me
am.
what you tell me what you tell them.
It is a fantastic project, Silvio. It's called the Dissident Project. The Dissident Project is a nonprofit speakers bureau under John Voices, which is a talent agency, a nonprofit talent agency for mostly liberty-oriented causes. This project started in 2022, and it's basically a speakers bureau. It was founded by a Venezuelan that is also a refugee, Daniel De Martino, and with an amazing group of people. And what they do is that they put together this speakers bureau, and all of us, we are first generation immigrants or refugees in the United States who escaped tyranny and authoritarian societies. We're talking about people from Cuba, Venezuela, China, Hong Kong, you name it. It's a very, very diverse group of speakers. And then we offer these presentations to middle schools and high school all over the United States, completely free of charge. Needless to say, being a 501c3 nonprofit, we are able to do this thank you to the generosity of the people that become members, of the donors that support this project. And I'm telling you, it is a fascinating and very humbling experience, Silvio, because you know how, I don't know which one is the equivalent of that saying in English, but how they say that nadie es profeta en su tierra. And I have been in this country for 23 years doing this in my communities, in libraries, in schools, with friends, just basically debunking this idea that you were mentioning before, and how Cuba and any socialist countries describe as this parallel reality. I always tell the student, you need to think about something like the movie The Matrix. One story and one reality and one educational system and one healthcare system is the one that the government propaganda has been getting out of Cuba for the last 60 something years. And another one completely different is the reality of the average Cuban person, like myself, like my family, like the second, third removed cousins that I still have there. And it's a very, very humbling experience, because people tend to think, oh, you're talking to teenagers, they're not into this or that. But when you make yourself vulnerable to tell your personal story to a young audience like that, and all of the sudden you see the faces, Silvio, the light bulbs going on, the mind blown, the questions that they ask at the end, like, oh, so they will report you to the political police because you were saying this or doing that, and then they will get a reward. And I'm like, yes. And the reward was like a Walmart style plastic bag with 2 bottles of cooking oil, 1 tube of toothpaste, and a bottle of shampoo and conditioner. And then you need to remember, we're talking about a generation of Americans that was born after the Berlin Wall
Right,
and
right.
fell, and after the Cold War, supposedly. And this is a generation that is, like you were saying earlier, is getting a distorted version of history when they're going to school every day.
Right.
So for me to be able to be part of this amazing project is really a true calling, because the way that I look at it is that if by sharing my story with these young Americans in any way, form, or shape, who help them to open their eyes to learn why is it important to have freedom, to support the democracy and the society that we have in the United States, to help them not to take what they have for granted. Even if I can change the mind or open the eyes of one person, it would be totally worth it.
No, you're exactly right. And in fact, you brought up a very good point, and something that I was thinking about too, because when we first came to the United States in the 60s and 70s, Cuba, everybody kind of knew
Mhm.
what had happened in Cuba, in the sense that they knew we were, political refugees. They knew we came from a communist country, and everybody could kind of relate to that. I mean, I would have friends of mine who knew that our family had left Cuba
Mhm.
for communism, or because of communism. But then with the collapse of the Soviet Union, and by the way, a lot of people don't realize that that happened 30 years ago.
Hmm.
I mean, we are now 30 years on this side of the collapse of the Soviet Union, which
That's
is really
true.
remarkable because who would have believed that? We all grew up on the other side of that
Hmm.
collapse. And now all of a sudden, the Soviet Union has been gone for 30 years or whatever, 31 years. And I think that that has made a lot of people forget the evils of communism.
Hmm.
And, I know that in Babalu, very often they talk about this museum of communism, the Museum of Communism or Victims of
The
Communism.
Victims of Communism Museum in DC. Yes.
Yes. And I know that, for example, in Florida, they have now started something where they teach the children
Hmm.
about communism, which I think it's a wonderful thing because communism is really the great evil, as far as I'm concerned. I think it's an even bigger evil than Nazism
It
because
is. Yeah.
because communism is the evil that, I mean, you think of the impact that communism had in the lives of good people, the economies it destroyed, the lives it destroyed. One of the things that I hate most about communism is the fact that it separated me from two cousins that I grew up with. I spent the years that I was in Cuba, I was always hanging around with two cousins, and then all of a sudden they're there and I'm here, and we can't even talk to each other because
No, it's evil. That's the way, that's the word that I use to describe it. And whether again I'm talking to these young audiences in high schools all over the United States or in shows like yours or with anybody, the way that I always describe it is that anything that is rooted in collectivism, which are all these examples that you were mentioning, Cuba, the Nazis, otherwise, they are rooted in force. They are rooted in completely obliterating and erasing your individual mind, your individual rights, your natural God-given rights, your individual freedoms for the sake of the collective, which again, we can debate for hours. It is a false sense of equity because the only thing that communism and socialism has achieved in the history of mankind is a bloody trail of murder of people and the equal redistribution of misery everywhere where it has been tried. So
right.
I think it's really important, and that's why I am so excited about this project, because if you look at it, there is only a few of us removing generations that can bring these first person testimonies to younger Americans so they can hear how our lives were in the societies and the totalitarian countries that we're coming from.
No, you're right, and I am so happy that you're doing this because there's just something like you said. There aren't that many people who can talk about communism, and I'm so happy that you're doing that with our students because too many of our students in the United States are being told a lie, and they're being told about socialism and, like you say, collective and public education and all that kind of stuff. And I'm not necessarily against public education. I prefer school choice, but that's another debate. But I'm just simply saying that when I first came here, it was a heck of a lot easier to explain to anybody
Mhm.
why Cubans had come here because everybody was familiar with the events. But so much time has passed by that I think the work you're doing is just absolutely fabulous, which is why I
Thank
really
you.
wanted to have you. And I know that we'll be airing this on Babalu. And I know that there are many Cubans in the Babalu family who are going to enjoy this as much as I have. But, like every good thing has to come to an end. And let's just say that this chapter has come to an end. But I really hope you give us your time again in the future because there are so many ideas that I have about shows we can do uh,
Absolutely.
that
Yeah, it
deal
will be
with.
my pleasure. And thank you again for having me and giving me, like a little window of time to keep putting our
Well, my pleasure. Listen,
out there. It's
what you're
important.
doing is absolutely great. But I do have to. You mentioned Isla de Pinos earlier in the. And did you say you lived in Isla de Pinos? Is
When I
that what?
was an infant, I was a baby.
Okay.
They moved me to Camagüey really quick. But yeah, my parents spent quite a few years living and working in there. So
Well,
that's a whole different experience
no, I
too.
know, but I have to tell you that Isla de Pinos always hits me because my father's cousin, Dr. Ignacio Segurola, who passed away a few years ago, spent 14 years
In the
in a
prison there.
prison, in the prison. And he was arrested right after the Bay of Pigs, which is, of course, before your generation, but nevertheless, it's part of the history. He was arrested around the time of the Bay of Pigs because he accused Castro of being a communist. Now, think about that. Castro declared himself a communist a few months later, and the people who had called him a communist were not released and told, "Yeah, you told the truth." So it's fascinating. So you mentioned that, and it
Yeah,
reminded
we
me
all
of.
have those stories, Silvio, in our family. I have an aunt on my mom's side of the family that he spent 2 years in one of the MAPs in Pinar del
Wow.
Rio. He needed to be re-educated because he was calling the red flags about Castro's government since day one. And you know what is even like, I wouldn't say, I mean, I'm going to say funny for a lack of a better word. Most of these stories, I have learned them after I was here in the United States, because during
Absolutely.
my 27 years of life in Cuba, there were many of those stories that even my own family never felt comfortable saying out loud to us, the
Yeah.
kids, in fear that, it could be poked out of us in a school or something like that and put the entire family at risk.
No, I know, and I heard some of those stories. I would hear a lot of those stories. I didn't hear them so much in Cuba, but I heard them later
Hmm.
when we were up here,
Yeah.
because every so often somebody would come and tell us. For example, the story of Pedro Luis Boitel, a story that I had never heard in Cuba. Uh, so a lot of these other books that were written
Me
in the
neither.
late,
I learned
and
about him when I came here to the
that's
United
right.
States. Hey, the
And
first book that I read when I landed in Miami was Animal Farm,
okay,
because that book was and is still censored in Cuba.
that's right. That's right. Now, the other thing you mentioned, I want to make sure that I understood you correctly. Did you live in Ciego de Avila, or your family was in Ciego de Avila?
No, my dad's side of the family were the ones that lived there. And I still have cousins and, second, third cousins living there.
Okay, you mentioned Ciego de Avila. My mother was born in Ciego de Avila. My mother was born in that main street there in front of Parque Martí. And
Hmm.
I'll never forget, as a little boy, walking down that Marcial Gomez, I think was the name of the street. And I remember walking down that street, and there's two things that stand out in my mind. I'll never forget them. I must have been 6 years old, but I remember it. And it was El Zapatero, the
Hmm.
guy who used to fix shoes,
Hmm.
which is a real art. I mean,
Yeah.
something that I die to find a Zapatero in Texas. They just don't have people like that anymore. A Zapatero who would fix your shoes. And the other one was El Centro Asturiano, which is right in the corner of where my mother's house used to be. And then the other thing is, my cousins and my brother and I would do the unthinkable. We would go in Los Elevados, Los Elevados del Ciego, right?
Hmm.
And we wouldn't tell our mothers that we were doing this. We would get in our bicycles and go up and then come right down. And
Oh,
how we didn't kill ourselves
you
is
still
because
don't know.
I think God was looking out for us, because that was the most dangerous and stupid thing. But when you're 7, 8 years old, you do those things.
That's
And
right.
so those are memories that I have. So not all the memories
Mhm.
are about communism, as they say. Some of the memories are cousins, people you never saw again.
That's true.
And that is sad. Think of our lives. Again, I'm thankful that we came to the United States, very grateful that I got to grow up here. But I really miss, there were so many people that I knew that I never saw again.
Me too.
And
But again, it goes back to the root of this government force and control. I
yes,
mean, there is
absolutely.
nothing new under the sun, Silvio. Divide and conquer is the oldest premise that they have adopted. And part of dividing the family between the ones that stayed, the revolutionaries, and the ones that left, the traitors, that's part of their entire scheme, to be able to control what 4 generations of Cubans for this long. Obviously, combined with everything
That's right.
else, but that's one
Yeah,
of the good tools that they use to entrench in power.
right. One of the people listening just sent me a note saying that it was called La Isla de la Juventud. I guess that's what they called it later. And
Isla,
you
yeah,
talk
Isla de
about,
Pinos was always the original geographical name. The Isla de la Juventud was a communist government change. That was not
right,
the original
exactly.
name
Yeah,
of the island.
exactly. That's
Yeah.
like changing the names of the provinces. And one of them is
Hmm.
Granma, I think, one of the
Yeah.
provinces, right? Which I
Hmm.
don't remember that one. But listen, thank you so much for giving us your time, and we'll do it again. I hope we do it again. And you were absolutely wonderful, and it was so nice to be able to travel with you into our mutual Cuban past, which is, of
Uh-huh.
course, mutual but different.
Yeah,
And that's what makes it.
thanks to you again for the time, the opportunity to talk and share the story with your audience, and obviously put out the good word for this amazing project that we're doing. Again, if we don't teach young Americans to appreciate what they have, it's what I always tell my kids. I don't know, Silvio, if I'm going to be successful in this battle, but I need to have the peace of mind that I look at my American born children 5, 10, 20 years from now, and I tell them I tried. I
That's right.
told my story until I get blue on my face trying to open the eyes of people around me. And I
No,
did my best so you didn't end up living
right.
in the same disaster that I have to escape for.
No, you're exactly right. It's a wonderful thing that you're doing, and
Mhm.
thank you so much for your time.
Thanks to
And
you.
send me. I don't know if you send me already, but send me the link to the organization. Maybe you did or didn't. I don't
I will,
remember.
yes, I
Send
will
me the link to
make
the
sure so
organization
that
so
way
we.
if people want to look
Right.
at it
Yeah.
and learn
So
more
I
about
can,
it, they
because
can
that
find
way I
it.
can put it in the show information for anybody who's
Absolutely.
into. You have a wonderful day, and
Thank
we
you.
will
You
talk to you
too.
later. Thank you
Okay,
so
bye.
much. Thank you so much. Well, that's a fascinating Cuban experience, or at least talking to another Cuban. What a cool thing that is, especially of different generations. But it's so great. I learned so much. But at the same time, it just reminds us that we're Cubans and that we share a story that is rather unique. So thanks to everybody for watching and listening. Thanks to my friend Ernie for sending me several comments that were very interesting. And everybody have a wonderful day. This is Silvio Canto in Dallas.